Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon in some parts of the world, and welcome to APQC's November KM webinar. I'm very excited. This is our penultimate KM webinar of the year, and we are continuing on the innovation theme that we've been dipping in and out of throughout the year. Last month, we heard from the KM team at Technip FMC about some of the operational integration between KM and innovation. This month, we've got a little bit different application and case study. We're going to talk about KM model innovation at Microsoft and how you innovate the KM strategy in an effective way, and also how you align KM with innovation outcomes. So I'm very excited to announce our speaker for today, Robin Ray Howitt, who is Worldwide Director of Modern Work Solutions at Microsoft. Thanks so much for being with us, Robin. Robin, I think you might be on mute. Robin, we are still not hearing you. I don't know if you're hearing me.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, excellent. Thanks.
It's actually, there's no excuse for this because it's late afternoon for me and obviously very early morning for you. So apologies for that.
Great. Thanks so much, Robin. I'm going to leave it with you.
Okay, brilliant. Well, you know, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I really do appreciate you coming to listen to this talk. As you've seen, my name is Robin. I work for Microsoft. I'm essentially a creative director, and a lot of my focus is on knowledge management and innovation. These two things fit so nicely together, as we'll actually see through the rest of this talk. I'm going to put my video off while I present, as it is in the middle of my screen, and I just need to move it for a second, if you don't mind. All right. So the focus for today is to provide you a perspective, a thesis, if you will, on how to enable business strategy through knowledge management innovation. And what we're going to cover is essentially a perspective on the key building blocks, the key KM innovation building blocks, explain what those are. And then the good part is to basically share, a real case study on how we've applied this at Microsoft to increase our innovation outcomes. And then, right at the end, we'll spend some time giving you some tips on how to get started if you would like to use some of this IP and approach. I will highlight that I do have about 35 minutes of content prepared for you. So you don't have to worry. You're not going to be sitting here looking at slides for the full, 55 minutes that's left. So no worries there at all. All right. But in reflecting for preparing this presentation, I really was struck again by, how important knowledge is to our lives. I mean, if you think about it, it's the lifeblood of most of what we do. Every day, millions of us around the world wake up and create and share and use knowledge to work, play, and learn. It's really like a key part of being human. It's such an important part of our civilization. Yet, what I still find pretty ironic when it comes to thinking about how important knowledge is that in my experience, and I've been a recipient of these thoughts myself, there's still a perception in many areas of the business that, KM programs don't provide as much business impact as we would like and contribute to as much innovation outcomes as we would like. Now, I'm highlighting that I don't think these programs don't give value. I think they give a lot of value, but there's just a perspective in some areas of the business that it isn't as high as it should be. Now, there are many reasons for this. Some of them include perhaps having the wrong strategy or not having enough resources. But I think, what I really think, is that there are blind spots, things we cannot see, KM elements that we don't typically consider normally when framing a KM strategy and indeed even developing a plan to actually implement one. And these blind spots are very similar to cooking an amazing meal. The first thing you got to get right is knowing what all of the right ingredients are. The difference between a bad, a good, and an amazing meal is whether you get the ingredients right. If you leave one out, or if you leave two out, you may have disastrous results. And then the next aspect of cooking an amazing meal, in addition to having the right ingredients, is the right process you go through to essentially prepare that meal. Oven can't be too hot, you can't cook it too long. And this really is the crux of this entire session. It's basically that. I think the key to consistently high business impact and contribution to organizational innovation from KM is to be able to see and use all of the key ingredients needed to work holistically and in harmony to give you that end result that you're looking for. And these ingredients and the cooking process are on this particular slide. I'm going to basically talk to you about two key aspects here. I'm going to be talking to you about a knowledge management canvas and the design process that you go through. And the canvas itself represents the 9 building blocks, the 9 key ingredients that work holistically together to enable your KM strategy. And that design process, that design thinking process, is essentially the cooking process you go through to create your KM model, evolve it, and essentially visualize it. Those of you that know the business model canvas will definitely see inspiration here from there. And that's for very good reason. So moving along, let's quickly double click on what is a KM model. Well, effectively, it really is just a way, like a business model, for describing the rationale for how your KM strategy, how KM in your organization creates and delivers and captures value. You can use this canvas to essentially assess your current approach. You can use it to design a new approach. And very importantly, you can use it to actually communicate visually what your KM strategy and model represents. And the key thing, I think, when it comes to this KM model, again, is to highlight it's composed of 9 interconnected building blocks that need to be configured in unity and harmony for the true end results to achieve what you're looking for. And here, we're going to quickly go through these 9 interconnected building blocks and spend a bit of time talking about the process of creating your KM model. And then the bulk of the session is going to be on a practical example of how we've applied this here at Microsoft. So clearly, when you're thinking about your KM strategy and implementing it and building a KM model, one of the first things that we think you should do is clearly consider and research and define who you're creating value for. Who are your KM personas or archetypes or groups of people that share similar business needs that need KM to help them succeed in their jobs? So the first key step is really understanding who these groups are and what their key KM needs represent. Once you've done that, the next key step is to essentially sit back and have a look at defining the KM services and solutions that you need to put in place to satisfy these very specific persona groups' needs and value levers. So this is primarily about looking at the services you can provide one-to-one for these persona groups. In this example, one of the personas that we may have come up with in our workforce is customer support. Well, customer support often needs to solve customer problems really quickly. So one of the solutions you could put in place for KM services is a knowledge base and expertise location. These are examples of one-to-one mappings in this particular model. So the next step to look at, once you've basically understood who you're creating value for and how you're going to serve that through the solutions, is to essentially then determine and figure out how are we going to serve these services and solutions to each of our personas. Don't ever overlook this, because in many cases, you may have a great KM service, but the people who are supposed to use it can't find it, and even more tragically, don't know how to use it. So the next key thing to really look at is how you're going to deliver each of those services to the user groups that are going to need them. And then the next key thing to look at, once you've understood who you're serving, how you're going to serve them, and what you're going to serve them, you then need to manage those relationships over time. You need to be able to essentially understand how your persona groups needs are evolving over time as your KM strategy evolves. You need to also be able to determine from them, are they receiving the value that they're supposed to receive? And indeed, you also need to help them in many instances consume some of these services. So KM relationships is another key block you need to manage. And you're already getting the picture, I think, that each of these blocks is connected. Each of these elements is dependent on the other. Then the next key thing to look at, the fifth key area is, and this is tragic in many instances, but once you understand what your personas want and the services you're going to provide them, the next key thing you have to do is to essentially be able to take what you feel they want and put those down into metrics that you can basically track to ensure that you're getting value from your KM services. And that would involve using knowledge analytics for each of your KM services and mapping those to the users, and then doing reporting. The sad thing is, if you can't show you're delivering value from your KM services, then most often business thinks you are not, which is completely wrong, because invariably a lot of what we do is intangible or we don't report on it. But that's the key aspect from KM value realization, is taking the time to ensure that value is delivered to your persona groups, and that you report on it, that you train them how to use these solutions, and that you also align their behavior with desired rewards and acknowledgement. So now I've talked about the front stage of this canvas, everything that faces your end users. The next key set of things that you've got to look at is, how are you going to basically build and provide all of these 5 things that I've just talked about? And here, essentially what you need to look at is framing out, what are your core KM activities? In other words, what are the core KM competencies that you need to have and put into place to essentially define your KM services and serve the rest of the model? And these are things such as KM governance, KM strategy definition, knowledge management process definition, all those sort of key KM competencies you need to have in place to essentially provide all of the services to the right. And clearly, very importantly, once you've figured out what your core competencies need to be, the next key thing you need to do is to make sure that you actually have the resources to essentially provide your core KM activities, build your KM services, service your KM relationships, and then deliver those services and measure value. So that's very important. We often overlook this. And that would be normally, physical, intellectual, and digital assets that you basically need, or resources that you need to provide for the rest of this. And once you've done that, what we often find in many of our KM teams is they're not very big. And a lot of what we've got to do to the right of this model takes partnering with internal and external stakeholder groups. So this is where you would basically secure partnerships to provide some of the things you cannot do from your core KM team. In other words, an executive sponsor to role model knowledge collaboration behaviors, or to fund this for you in a particular department, or APQC to help you define your knowledge flow processes, etc., or Microsoft for your digital platform, as an example. And then the next key thing, the last key thing, is to really look at your financial model. How are you going to basically pay for this entire KM model? How are you going to essentially fund it? And then also in many instances, recoup that money and determine your ROI. So this essentially is the KM canvas in those 9 interdependent blocks that I personally had many blind spots to in the past when putting KM strategies together and implementing them. Now, the question you might be asking yourself at this point is, how would you actually put this into place at your organization? How would you create your own KM model? And we'll talk a little bit about that now. But in summary, a KM model, if you remember one thing, is really a visual blueprint that you can use to challenge your current thinking and to innovate your current approach to KM. What's super important to also take a moment to reflect on is that a KM model is an accompaniment to your KM strategy. So your KM strategy is typically that vision you set for where you want to go and what you want to achieve with KM. And I really look at a KM model as kind of like the blueprint for how you're going to get there and essentially operationalize your KM strategy, how you're going to make sure that what you've written down in your amazing PowerPoint slides for your vision actually works in the real world. And that's what the KM model is there to help you with. And in terms of creating your model, as mentioned, the cooking process is essentially design thinking based. So the process that you go through to create a new, to transform an existing, and to optimize a current KM model is really very much rooted in design thinking. And a key thing to note here too is you can apply this at the enterprise all up level. You can focus this just on a business unit, a function, and even I've done it at project and team level. So it's very scalable, and you don't have to boil the ocean all at once while looking at designing your KM model and indeed even reflecting on one within your business. So the design process is design thinking based, as mentioned. There are two key blocks or components to this. The first is to essentially define your conceptual KM model, which should be based on your KM strategy. It should support your KM strategy, or if you're designing a KM model for a particular business unit, it should reflect your business unit strategy, as an example. And the process you go through, clearly you do a bit of research to understand your end users and the broader goals that they're after. You do some ideation to come up with the core concepts on the canvas. You then develop your first or third or fourth draft of your canvas. You test that internally first, and then you move to the prototyping phase, which is testing this in real world terms. So it's design thinking based, and there are two key components to do that. So that's how you would apply one of these things to your organization. But don't worry, in the how to get started section, I'll show you how you can get going much quicker and far more simply. So I'd like to do a quick poll now, if that's possible. How many of you use design thinking in your approach to KM? I'm just very interested to see. And I don't know how long you typically, Lauren or Nikki, we give people to fill these out.
This is a pretty easy poll, so hopefully it won't take too long for people to click on it, and then Nikki will show the results.
Fantastic. Oh, amazing. Looking now at the results, looks like fairly quite a few actually use it. That's great. Well, then knowledge management model innovation will be easy for you. And for those that aren't using it, it'll be a wonderful new journey of exploration, exploring design thinking. But let's move on. What we're going to do now is talk to you how we applied KM model innovation at Microsoft. Because we're talking specifically about innovation, I thought I would show you how we applied this to our innovation initiative. So in Microsoft, I think like probably all of your businesses, continual innovation is like absolutely key to survival. And for us, we are relentlessly looking at new ways and broader ways to innovate all the time. So 4 years ago, in my area of the business, whilst we were plotting out how we could drive deeper innovation across our business, a stark, glaring, hard fact hit us. We realized that only 2% of our workforce are formally being paid to come to work to essentially create products and services. Those are the people that are in product development, but they're an overwhelmingly small part of your workforce. And that the other 98% of the folks in our org were essentially completely untapped and a massive sort of creative potential. So we set out to change the world at that point. So we thought by essentially coming up with a grassroots innovation program. The key purpose of that 4 years ago was to see if we could drive even more business growth through grassroots innovation, which is primarily about enabling anybody, no matter where they are in your workforce, to be able to invent what's next, get funding, and essentially experiment with their ideas and hopefully result in shipping products and services for you. So that was our vision. We got off to a very excitable start. However, 1 year later, when our management was looking at the outcomes, because that's what they do, unfortunately, even though there was a lot of excitement, we didn't have amazing outcomes from this particular initiative. We had very few shipping innovations, but lots of ideas. So we went back to the drawing board, and one of the key things that came out, which was very obvious, was that knowledge was an issue. Knowledge, a key aspect of this innovation process, was problematic. So we decided, let's embark on a KM model innovation experiment. And our goal for that experiment was to enable our grassroots innovators with the right knowledge at the right time to improve our innovation outcomes. And now I'm going to take you through our 9-block canvas, our KM canvas, our grassroots innovation canvas that we basically helped us uncover blind spots and dramatically improve innovation outcomes. So I really believe without this approach, we would have not had the success that we've had. So the first thing we did was obviously take a step back and look at understanding, who are these innovation stakeholders? Who are the archetypes we are serving? And we discovered there were actually 4 key groups. We have the innovators, folks who want to innovate and submit ideas, but we discovered through this process that many of them didn't know design thinking. Innovation is a design thinking process, and didn't have the technical skills to actually build their idea out. So there's a knowledge gap right there and then. I might have an amazing idea, but I don't know how to incubate it, and I don't know how to build it. And the next key group that we discovered, which we never knew about, were contributors. We call them contributors. These are folks, experts, who don't have an idea themselves they would like to explore, but really want to share their knowledge and expertise and contribute to other people's ideas. For those folks, they were completely overlooked because they had no way of finding out what ideas were being submitted and how to attach themselves to those. And then the management, the folks from across our organization who are given the charge of evaluating these amazing ideas and making investment decisions, what we discovered in terms of knowledge there was that because so many of these ideas are very technical, a lot of the managers didn't have the ability or the knowledge to evaluate technical feasibility for some of these things. So that was another area, blind spot we uncovered. And then the last group, and probably one of the most important, which we completely overlooked too, were the consumers of this innovation. So once an innovation has come to light through this process, there's going to be people who want to use that innovation and apply it to their projects. And we discovered that people who try to do that really didn't know how to apply what was coming out of this particular program. So we already had, just from looking at our key KM personas, some major blind spots and knowledge gaps that we basically uncovered. Then the next key thing that we were able to do once we'd had a look at this was essentially now reinvigorate and define some new KM services to service our innovation program. And that didn't take too long to sort out. What we did, typical knowledge management 101, we created a learning path. Learning that we applied and made available to all of these innovators, so that we taught them the innovation process and how to recruit experts, and indeed how to evaluate technical feasibility for their projects. We put expertise recruitment in place, allowing contributors to basically sign up as subject matter experts for particular areas and basically pledge their allegiance to certain project types. That also allowed the innovators to go and find experts through that recruitment tool. The other key thing is we massively updated our ideas app with better knowledge management functionality, allowing anyone to basically search, find, tag, comment, and even add additional content to folks' ideas. And then what we also were able to do, because we had expertise, experts, technical experts who'd signed up, for managers, we created an impact assessment assistant guide. What that basically means is we were able to package up all of the technical criteria that you need to look at to fully evaluate whether something is going to be successful. And then we combined that assessment guide and paired up our managers with technical experts. So they now had all the knowledge they needed to basically evaluate if something's going to work or not. And then the last thing we did for our consumers is we basically created a content management system, a document management system, which is really a structured schema, a structured format that we put all of these shipping innovations into so that it would be easy to use and consume. So those are the things that we did. Immediately, we started to see that we would have some amazing value. And then the next key thing that we basically did was really explore, well, we've got these nice new KM services. We know who they're for. We need to pay a bit of attention to how we're going to get them to those audiences, how we're going to serve them up in a way that's easy to consume and easy for the knowledge flow to essentially be automated through. And here, obviously, because we work for Microsoft, we couldn't buy anything. We had to make our own. So we created our own, Microsoft Teams app that brought all of this functionality together for the innovators, contributors, managers, and consumers. We had a private team channel just for the managers to essentially evaluate and talk with technical reviewers. And then we built a document management library also available through this environment to access the shipping innovations for our consumers. Now, without looking closely at the service delivery aspect, we probably would have had apps all over the place, and it would have been hard for people to find and essentially use some of these things. Now, the next key thing that we did, because once again, as mentioned, once you know who you're serving, they're going to be around for a while, those persona groups. The next key thing is to figure out how are you going to continually understand and evolve the services you're offering for those stakeholder groups, because needs change over time. So what we did is we set up a number of relationship types with these various groups to essentially help them use all of these services and to essentially support each other. So we had very specific KM relationships that we set up with those groups to evolve the approach and to essentially receive feedback. A very important element too of ongoing improvement. Now, as mentioned earlier, the next key thing is really looking at the value realization side of things. At the end of the day, at the start of this, I said our goal was to innovate. So we need to produce innovations. And therefore, you need this value realization stream, taking the time to determine what are the metrics that represent the KM value coming out of your particular program for each of those persona types and for each of those services. And for us, that involved measuring how many ideas were being put into place, how many contributors were signing up, how many stories were being produced, how much money was being invested, how much return we were getting back, and indeed, very importantly, how many people were participating overall. And for that, we used adoption and change management to get people to participate and engage in knowledge collaboration behaviors. And then very importantly, to make people come back and to broaden it more than just the 10% who always like to innovate, to broaden the program, we essentially put rewards and recognition into place to encourage a broader stakeholder group to come back. So that value realization stream allowed us to encourage people to use these services in the right way and to reward them for it, and then to also report back to our leadership how much value we're actually getting from these KM services so we can get additional funding. So this, is the first half of the story that this canvas helped us basically plot, much of which was invisible before we used this approach. We're now going to talk briefly about the backstage, the engine room for for producing this model. And for us here, we needed to look clearly at the core KM activities, our core competencies. What were the core KM activities that we needed to put into place to basically provide for the rest of this model? And for us, that was very definitely designing and deploying these KM services. That was absolutely key. We had to do that. Without that, you don't have KM services in place. The other key thing, we needed to define KM standards. How are we going to govern the knowledge and the innovation and the IP flowing through this process? How secure is it? And indeed, what is our organizational model going to be from a KM standpoint? And then incredibly importantly, and I often overlooked this before, was really taking a critical look at defining and designing your knowledge flow processes very specific to the business you're trying to enable. And here, it was primarily aligning our knowledge flow processes with our innovation process. So if you look at all of those KM services and then those KM personas, it was primarily ensuring that through all of those apps, folks could basically create, share, find, collaborate, use, and consume the knowledge through this entire process. And without doing that, you often find that the knowledge doesn't flow as well as it could through your business processes. So that's the KM activities. Then the next key thing, obviously you need to have resources to essentially provide for this entire model. And for us, we thought we had the right digital platform, but we didn't. We needed to have specific additions to that digital platform to provide those KM services and to allow us to measure the output. We also discovered that we didn't have all of the KM expertise we needed in our team. We needed more technical folks to come and help us build things that had experience building KM solutions for customers. And we also discovered we needed more money than we originally budgeted, because now we understood all of the other blocks. It's easier to provide a budget that you can work with and go in campaign management for. And the next key thing, we also discovered, as I said, we didn't have all of the expertise in our team. We needed to get some partners. And one of the key things we did was engage 2 or 3 executive sponsors who really helped us secure additional funding, but even more importantly, essentially role modeled the knowledge collaboration behaviors that we so desperately needed people to basically do. And they were visible, and that made a massive difference. And I used to overlook the importance of exec sponsorship, but this made a massive difference from the front end. And then obviously we didn't have a lot of change management experience internally within our team, and we needed to go to our ACM or change management team to help us with our processes. And then the last thing we were able to do, once we understood all of this, as mentioned, is to define our financial model. And that was getting very granular about the OPEX costs for our digital platform, how much money we needed. It's internal money, utilization, that's what we call it, when you get money to pay consultants. So how much money we needed to pay our field consultants who volunteered to help build these things. And then essentially exactly how much we needed for our awards. Now you can see, I've given you a whirlwind tour of how we used knowledge management innovation to build our own entrepreneurship KM model. All of these building blocks are interconnected. Many of them were blind spots for us previously. And the results are particularly pleasing, I think. Look, we may have been able to achieve these results through other mechanisms, but what I can say is for the 18 months before we were fully up and running with the KM model, we essentially only managed to ship 6 innovation products, literally from 200 ideas. And those were only reused around 8 times, which is not a great return on investment. We did have 96 passionate community members who were participating initially, and we only managed to produce 6 innovation stories. I thought that was amazing at the time, to be honest, because we weren't telling that many stories. best practices and things like that. But in the last 18 months, we've basically gone from 6 innovation products to 29. So 29 shipping products and services that were never there before, or we never would have seen, because they came from the broader 98% of the workforce. They had a platform to do this now. They have also been used, those 29 shipping innovations, in about 70 different projects across the company, and even indeed with customers. And our community is around 1,000 active, which is a lot. It gets very noisy in there, in that team. And we've now managed to produce around 63 knowledge sharing stories. And we make those as videos, so there's a lot of views. We found that videos seem to be more effective and gain more traction than writing things down. So all in all, we truly believe that KM model innovation can really materially help you with your own innovation outcomes. But more importantly, if you apply this model and that design process to your KM strategy or other business objectives, you too can probably get some really, really great outcomes. And now, before we move to how to get started and more questions, just a quick poll. Now that I've been through these 9 building blocks and you reflect on your own approach to KM and traditional strategy, have any blind spots come into your head or popped into your head just from listening to some of these things? It'd be very interesting to hear.
Thanks, Robin. We'll leave it open just for a couple of seconds,
Yes,
and then we'll close and pop up the results.
100%, no worries. I'm just going to close that. Shall I carry on, Lauren, or do you want me to wait for a couple of minutes or minutes?
I think that the responses are coming up. Excellent. You got pretty good uptake on people recognizing blind spots, so that's great.
Yeah, that's the key thing, the things that we were not aware of that we traditionally haven't been focusing on, they're all connected. All right, so now what I'm going to do, it's moving to the end of this lot. I said I wouldn't be presenting for the full time. I'm going to give you some guidance on how to get started with this approach. Now, I think, and I think Lauren advised me initially against the slide, but I'm sharing it with you because I think the right way to start is to essentially go and do an assessment of your current KM model. I think that's the key thing. Sorry, my slides are moving ahead here by my own mistake. The key way to start is to basically print this canvas out. I've given you a set of trigger questions and indeed some patterns that you can look at. And if you print this out, and then in the appendix, there's a blank version of this. Maybe take 2 to 3 hours and create your own canvas of your existing approach to KM, or plot your strategy against this, create your first KM model, and that will really help you again pick up a whole lot of blind spots that you might not have seen before. I think that's the easiest way to get started, is to basically assess how you currently do things, and you can use what I've got up here for you to get started, plus the blank one in the appendix to plot your results against. Now, if you want to go further and you want to learn more about this and you want additional content and guidance, you can most certainly reach out to me. I'm not looking for consulting or anything like that, promise you, or to provide consulting. I will gladly share the ton of additional content we have, and we've created plugins to this canvas, etc., so that it goes a lot deeper. I'll gladly share that if you're interested. But as I said, you need to be interested, and that's why I haven't given too much more here, because if you're not, it's probably a waste of time. But if you want to, please do definitely reach out through LinkedIn, and I'll gladly help. Now, what I wanted to do, Lauren, if you wouldn't mind putting the poll up again, or Nikki, just to gauge if there is interest in exploring an approach like this in your own organization. It'd be lovely to see what people feel. if they think I'm absolutely mad, or if there is potentially something of value here.
No, I think that's great, Robin, and I'm sure you'll have a cohort of people who are interested. It was funny as you're presenting, and when I saw the slides earlier, I think there's a lot of alignment to the methodology you're using to APQC's KM implementation roadmap. But I love the design thinking piece that you've brought out and really putting those personas first. I think that's really insightful and good way to approach the KM program design and strategic alignment.
That's great, Lauren. Thank you very much. And just for you to know that a lot of the plugins we created are definitely APQC aligned. So your knowledge flow processes, your perspectives on KM governance, your perspectives on community of practice, even a lot of the metrics or KM measures that you talk about. We've also created plugins for all of that because it's such incredible content. That being said, I am actually done. This is the blank copy for you. And if there are any questions, now's the time.
That's great, Robin. And we definitely have a few questions, and I'm sure a few more will come through. So the first question that we received is Microsoft Teams a KM partner? And I think this is more broadly asking how the KM team works with the technology side and how you think about that in that partnership model in the KM innovation model.
Yes. So our IT team, who provides all of these services internally, let me rephrase, all of our Microsoft services to employees, we have an IT organization that provides that. They are definitely a partner for us for sure, because they are the ones that we need to go and get tenants for, and we need help provisioning things. So definitely a key partner. We don't own any of that infrastructure ourselves. We basically get it provisioned by our IT organization. I don't know if that helped answer the question.
Yeah, if people have follow-ups, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and if anybody has additional questions. So the next question was about the personas that you presented in that first box. So Robin, how did you actually arrive at or discover those KM personas, the innovators, contributors, management, and consumers? Our audience analysis was more granular along functional lines. So I think if you could just go a little deeper into how you developed the particular personas that you sort of pursued through the model.
100%. So our model, our entrepreneurship model or grassroots model, actually cut across functions and across departments. So we were serving essentially anyone that had an amazing idea, no matter where they were. And through doing some research, we did surveys and a lot of research, we discovered who the various persona types were by understanding what the various people participating in the program actually wanted. So we did a lot of research, and through that research, that allowed us to then come up with and massage our persona types as we have them today. And as I said, they're in those 4 specific categories because they cut across departments and therefore aren't functional and apply to any area of the business, and came up through the research.
Yeah, we have a lot of stakeholder interview templates and things like that. I think some of those tools play in well to that persona development, but obviously it depends on what level you're looking at it, right? Because I think you can do that for particular projects or particular approaches, or at that kind of higher level for KM strategies and goals.
No, to give an example, we basically would have interviews and surveys cutting across all of these various departments, and then we analyze that research coming back, and then we could see the key categories. No matter what department you're in, there's a group of people that want to innovate, they want to create and do and put ideas forward. And then no matter which department or function, there's people who basically want to contribute. They don't want to own their own idea. So through the research and the interviews, that allowed us to basically see what these various persona groups look like.
Yeah, you're also seeing that adoption curve kind of play out in real time as well. Yeah. So we've got a bunch more questions. I'm just going to take these in order. So, how do you raise awareness about existing knowledge and innovation tools in the organization? Do you centralize them? And if yes, how?
We drive awareness. That is such a challenge, I'll be honest with you. Um, the reason being, if you look at your inbox today yourself, you probably have more in there than you can possibly deal with. Then on top of that, you might have Microsoft Teams or Slack, and you're getting messages bombard you from those particular areas. And we initially used to have newsletters that we would send out to drive awareness, but I saw that a very, very small percentage of people were looking at those things. So what we then did is we basically moved to videos. We call them solution selfies, short videos, fun videos, very similar to YouTube shorts and things like that, where we would provide an overview of a particular service. And then in many instances, we would back that up with a real user story of somebody using that, talking about the benefits. And then we would basically share those videos out through our communities, through our official communication channels, through Teams, and we would link to them in our newsletters. And the videos really allowed us to increase awareness for the services that we actually have had today. Are you seeing similar things, Lauren?
I love your solution selfie idea because it celebrates and recognizes the people who've done great things, and it also creates a little bit of that FOMO, fear of missing out, when people see those. So I think it's a really smart approach. So the next question is about the role of change management and communication in the launch and sustainment of your program. You've probably talked a little bit about the communication piece, but I don't know if there's more you would want to say in terms of change management.
Change management, what an important part of this entire thing, because it's one thing knowing the service you want to provide and design, in other words, designing a great KM service and knowing who it's for, but it's an entire other thing to get those people to use what you provided for them. So we actually have at Microsoft, we call it the ACM team. It's really the adoption and change management team. And what they do, they get to know your personas really well. And then they essentially get involved in that coaching process that I talked about on the slide there. And they spend time coaching the various parties to use the things that we've got in the right way. And we find with ACM or change management, if you do it well, you can massively increase the usage of the tool you're providing. The speed at which people adopt it goes up, and ultimate utilization, that's what we call it. That is actually using the full functionality of that service that you provided for them. Before we looked at using change management, we'd probably get like 20% of the features being used and maybe half the amount of participation. So I think that is as important as anything on that particular slide.
Well, and you're lucky because you have a adoption and change management team that you can plug into. I do recommend people, even if you don't have that structure, if you have any formal change managers in your organization, even if they're not, at least go have a conversation. They might be able to help you find some blind spots and things like that. I strongly believe in change management as a profession.
Yes,
and the professionals have great insights.
And on that note, I think our team basically adheres to a methodology from ProSci, PROSCI, ProSci. It's kind of like apparently really good change management material, and they're certified in all of that. So if you're interested, you can get yourself certified and apply that internally to your company.
So the next question is, how much time did it take to set up the framework for the first time?
The KM model itself, that actually evolved probably over a 6-month time frame. And indeed, it probably took another 6 months to get all of the changes in place. That's why I said an 18-month window to yield the benefits. So we were probably up and running from the framework to the changes in about a year. And then it took us another 8 months of active value realization to get those innovation products out and to yield all the benefits. But, it all depends on how many resources you have. You can do it a heck of a lot quicker. I mean, I think with what some of the stuff we've produced, you can save a lot of time. We were making that canvas, or figuring it out as we were going along, and now it's done. And then the other side, we only had, I think, 2 to 3 people in our core innovation and KM team that were dedicated to this. If you've got more, you can go much faster.
You perfectly anticipated the question. Somebody just typed, how many people were working full-time on your KM model, right as you were saying that. So you're very in tune today.
So 2 to 3 of us that were dedicated, but obviously a virtual team of stakeholders from all over. A lot of volunteers, folks who are super passionate about driving change in their areas of the business that wanted to participate. So I'd say 2 to 3 key, and then an extended of about 15. But those 15 are definitely not full-time. They were maybe dedicating 4 or 5 hours a week to help us.
So the next question is around the rewards and recognition program, and they were asking if you could give an example of the rewards and recognition.
Yes, 100%. Now, the first thing you might be thinking, because I said money, we've discovered that, quite honestly, the monetary rewards isn't really a massive thing for people. What they really love, particularly creators, is they want to be recognized, and they want their innovation and their work shared with a broad audience. And then from that audience to receive recognition and things like that. So what we do from a recognition standpoint, and they love it more than money, is essentially we get our VP, at the highest level in the organization that I work in, to basically send out awards for these innovators. And it's basically like a certificate and a badge. And people go mad for that. They post it to LinkedIn, and you see them again year after year participating. And then from a monetary standpoint, we did initially experiment with some money, but we got feedback that, it's not the money, it's really the recognition we get. And then we started to move to prizes as well. So we have prizes that we give, trophies for the in-person event that we run, T-shirts, books, innovation kit, things like that. So the short of it is prizes and recognition, way more than money, is what motivated our people to participate.
I think that aligns very well with what we see in the research. People want to feel visible, they want to feel recognized, they want professional development, learning opportunities. Not that they won't take money if you give it to them, but it's not actually the biggest motivator.
And money is harder to get often. If you're doing something across your organization and you got to deal with payroll, it's like hard. And if you have a global company, if you have folks in Germany or Scandinavia or other areas, it's not as easy to add money to their paycheck. It's difficult. So we discovered that was another thing to think about, and that's why we also go for prizes and recognition.
So I think you've partially answered this just talking about the audience, but the next question is, how do you motivate people to share their stories, ideas, and knowledge with the larger group using the existing tools? So obviously some of that's, I think, baked into these innovators who want their ideas to be used, but do you have any other tips, especially if you're dealing with people who maybe don't have that natural inclination?
No, that's a very good question. What we do find, to get going, there's always going to be a bunch of folks, a small bunch of folks who really want to share and tell their story. So we started with them, and we coached them through producing their own solution selfies. That got shared out and garnered a lot of traction from other innovators. What we also discovered then is there was still a large group that wasn't actively sharing their stories. And we discovered that it wasn't because they didn't want to, they just didn't make time in their calendar to actually do it. So we have, with that little V team, we run these solution selfie campaigns where we constantly remind them, we put things in their calendar, we give them guidance on how to create their little story. And with that constant reminder and putting time in their diaries, we get a lot of them to actually do it.
So I've got one final question. This will be our last question for the day, and it's a great place to conclude. What suggestions can you give when you are starting out and you find participation is low?
When participation is low, find one great story. Even if you have very few participants, there must be a good story you can tell about some aspect of success, even if it's a small victory that somebody else in your company has basically benefited from using, some output from your program. So I think finding those small wins and then communicating those in the form of stories really helps. I mean, you know what it's like. I think you mentioned it. When you see things on Instagram, you think it's better than it really is. Those people are happier in their lives than they really are. And that's the same thing. You produce a nice short story and it looks far bigger than it perhaps is, but that in turn then starts influencing others to say, I want to be a part of that.
Absolutely. I think that the power of getting those great success stories and then starting to target them and communicate them with the right audiences is so powerful.
Yes,
Absolutely.
because we're story machines, aren't we? The narratives we tell ourselves every day, the way we perceive the world, it's all one big story. And that's an amazing place to start and end.
Yeah, that's what we see in the research is the senior leaders want to see data to support the program, but what the end users want to see are those success stories and use
Exactly.
cases. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Robin. This has been a fantastic presentation to get how you thought about this and then how you applied it at Microsoft is just great. So we've got your contact information up here. I know that you were very generous in saying that you would send some additional information and insight to folks if they want to get in touch with you. I think we've just got a few reminders here for folks. You'll receive a copy of the slides and recording. We do have a satisfaction survey that'll pop up at the end of the webinar, so please take that if you can. You can learn about additional webinars and events on our website, and you can also watch any of our past webinars on demand. And last month, we also had an innovation tie-in, so if that's a topic of interest, I recommend looking at that webinar as well. So please connect with us in all the places we are. Thank you again, Robin, for your time and insights. And I hope to see all of you in December. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day.
Take care.